There are several requirements for getting an E2 visa, and some of the requirements I really don't talk to clients about when I meet with them because they're really simple yes or no requirements. So if you go on the embassy website and you look up E2 visa, it really does list what all the requirements are. And again, we don't need to spend time today talking about the requirements that are simple yes or no's or things that we can control when we make the investment or put the case together. So we won't talk about those. The requirements really that are important to talk about that I think are also somewhat controversial at times are the requirement that you have to make a substantial investment in a U.S. business. And then secondly, the requirement that the business that you invest in has to be non-marginal. And so, these two requirements I have found over the years are kind of the most misunderstood in a lot of ways. And the reason for that, I think, is that there's a lot of bad information out there. If you look at websites and forums, and there are just a lot of places where it talks about these requirements, and what they're saying, I don't agree with, and I'm not even really sure how they came up with what they're saying. So the first one is that you have to make a substantial investment in a U.S. business. I would say there the biggest misunderstanding there is what is the idea, what is a substantial investment? And where most people go wrong with this is they try to equate a dollar amount to that concept of being a substantial investment. So you oftentimes hear people talk about the fact that you have to invest at least $100,000 or $200,000. I hear numbers all over the place as far as what is this requirement. And I think that confuses people right off because you would think it should be a pretty consistent number, but again, I hear all different numbers. In reality, when you look at the regulations, there is no bright line test as far as what dollar amount qualifies as an E2 visa category. So there is nowhere that anybody will ever be able to show you a regulation or a requirement that says you have to invest X dollars in order to qualify. Really, the concept of making a substantial investment is more of an idea than it is a bright line test like that. And really, if you boil it down to its kind of simplest form, a substantial investment is an investment amount that gets you a business that in all other respects qualifies for an E2 visa. So, and there's some other technical aspects to what is a substantial investment, but really, if we identify a business that in all other respects qualifies for an E2 visa, whatever that price is, if you invest that amount, then that is a substantial investment. So I would say the first place that people really go wrong is, again, trying to put a specific dollar amount on that idea of a substantial investment. So there isn't a requirement that we have to find a business that has a certain price. But with that said, there is somewhat of a practical minimum, even though it's not a statutory minimum. There is somewhat of a practical minimum because in order to find a business that's going to be worth buying and that's going to generate enough income and maybe employ enough other workers so that you can meet the second requirement we're going to talk about, which is marginality, you really have to be investing a reasonably decent amount of money. So, I'm looking at businesses for over 20 years. It's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to find a business that's going to generate enough income and create enough employment to meet the marginality requirement we're going to talk about for $25,000 or $50,000, or even when you get under $100,000. I'm not saying when you're in the higher number, closer to 100,000, that it's impossible, but it's much more difficult to find businesses that are going to work for under $100,000. Doesn't mean that that's a requirement. It just means that from a practical standpoint, it's very difficult to find that. I would say that in the main, when it comes to pricing, businesses that are worth buying and that are going to fit really well with the E2 visa category, we typically are trying to be somewhere in the 150 to 250,000 price range, kind of minimum. Again, doesn't mean we've done E2 visa cases successfully with purchases of businesses for 125,000, 100,000, even 90,000, even less. But in the main, when we're looking at businesses that are going to meet this next requirement we're going to talk about, 150,000 to 250 is a good range to be in. Marginality is also somewhat misunderstood because it's a little confusing in some ways, but marginality basically is the requirement that says that the business has to basically do two things. And it's a little kind of hazy the way it's written in the regulations, because it kind of seems to talk about it in some ways like it's one of the two things, but in reality, what I generally have seen over the years is that most treaty visa officers are generally looking at it having to kind of do both of these things at the same time. And the two things, in order for a business to be non-marginal, it has to basically, A, generate an income that the investor can live on. And I'm paraphrasing this because this isn't the way it's written, but makes it a little easier to understand if you don't talk about it in technical terms. So the first requirement for marginality to be non-marginal is that the business has to generate an income that you can live on. And then the second requirement is that there has to be sufficient other employment created so that you're not the one primarily providing the goods and services of the business. Again, paraphrasing, not the way it's written, but so in my experience, a business that can do those two things qualifies. Again, where I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, where you go on sites and you talk to people and it gets really confusing at times, is okay, well, what are those, what are the exact bright line tests again for these two things? And it's somewhat difficult sometimes to explain to people that there really are no bright line tests. So with regard to generating a living income for the investor, for example, the first requirement, again, I think people try to assign a number to that. So professionals, lawyers, consultants, if you go on various sites, you'll see that there's a dollar amount that they say, oh, well, this is the amount of income that the business has to generate. And there's nowhere in the law where it has those kinds of bright line tests. It's really a subjective thing that is somewhat dependent upon the circumstances. And I think that it makes sense that the law was written that way, because if you think about it, the amount of money that somebody needs as a living income to live in Orlando is radically different than the amount somebody needs to live in Los Angeles. So it's really dependent upon where you're at, what the circumstances are. We tend to try to put some, sense around it. We try to look at what is the median household income in the area where you're making the investment. In the Central Florida area, that number tends to be, based on different counties, tends to be somewhere in the mid to high 40s. So we tend to look for businesses, when we're looking for qualifying businesses, that are going to generate at least an income for you of $50,000. Not saying necessarily that you are going to want to live on $50,000, but as a kind of lower end of the scale, that's generally what we're shooting for. Again, it's not statutory in any way, but that is, what we've interpreted as kind of being the bottom end of what we really should be looking for. The second part of the requirement is that while the business is generating that income you can live on, it also has to be created. The way the law reads is it has to create a significant economic impact, is what that kind of second requirement is, which really confuses people. Well, what does that mean? It's been interpreted generally as meaning creating employment. And again, there's an area, this is an area that creates a lot of confusion for people where, people talk about what kind of employment, direct employment versus independent contractors, full-time employment versus part-time employment, American workers versus not American workers, even number of workers, how many do you have to have? And again, the law is not, it's not bright line tests like that. So it is very subjective, and again, I would say driven by the circumstances and the facts. So the key thing to know, I guess, when you're looking at that part of the requirement of marginality when it comes to creating employment is it isn't so much important whether that employment is full-time or part-time, or whether it's 5 people or 2 people, or whether they're, direct or W-2 employees or independent contractors. That's really not as important as just that there are sufficient other workers so that you are truly an investor. You're not coming over to be a worker. It doesn't mean you may not also be participating in providing the goods and services of the business, but that you're not the sole person or the primary one doing it. That you are truly an investor who is directing and directing other resources, including other people, to provide those goods and services. So I would say that those 2 requirements, the substantial investment and marginality, are really kind of the most misunderstood, the subject of kind of the most misinformation, and those are really the reasons why E-2 visa cases succeed and fail. The other requirements that if you go to the embassy website and look at, are pretty much simple, straight yes or no answers. Whereas these other ones, marginality and substantial investment, we really need to make sure when we're looking at businesses that those requirements are going to be able to be met.